Morning. Charter Review Commission is here with a full attendance. Everybody is here. And we have staff. So I will acknowledge a quorum and seek Anna's consent to proceed with our guest speaker before we move into our administrative business so that he has an opportunity to talk to us, and then we'll do our administrative business afterwards. This morning we had Gene Smith. He is our County Council's Deputy Director for Budget and Policy. And he tells me he has come prepared to answer our questions, and I have posed really two topics that we have been discussing recently in my prior exchanges with him, and in this order. First, Charter Section 310, which deals with budget surpluses and the general fund cap of 5% on surplus in the general fund. And then we have recently also looked at some materials to talk about our revenue stabilization fund, which is a separate source for county reserves. We'll start off with that topic, and then the second topic will be the ballot initiative petition that is circulating currently that would revise Charter Section 305, dealing with approval of the operating budget and the number of votes it takes for council members to increase the operating budget. So let's start off with Section 310. I am going to, I guess, start with to Jeff, since he has been the one who's most vociferous in talking about this topic and knows the most about it.
No, that's the right word, Jim.
Yeah, I've been a loss for words when it comes to budget surplus. So persistent, knowledgeable, whatever adjective suits you. So why don't we start it off? You can kick it off, and I have some other questions I have written down here, but we'll get to this.
So my vociferousness is coming from having worked in local governments for most of my career. And there, it was a pretty straightforward thing about budget reserves. You put it into your, usually it was in the charter, but it could have been in the code of ordinances, but it was put in place to ensure. I worked in Florida. We had hurricanes, need to make sure that you had enough operating revenue to cover expenses if you had a bad storm and you were out of whack for a couple of months. It was a single source. It was separate from all the capital funds. It was designed to maintain operations. In looking at the county's budget, what I saw was a cap of 5%, and that kind of triggered my question as to, why 5%, why capped? If it doesn't cover. It didn't. I think when I did the math, it was like a month or a month and a half, maybe, of operating, so that didn't make sense. So then we started digging into this, and then we discovered that there's the separate stabilization fund that is not capped, and in fact has been higher, or at least the total has been higher than the 10% that's usually recommended by GFOA and those kinds of organizations. So that led to a discussion about whether we need a cap on the 5%, whether maybe there's something that should be done to make it more formal for the bond rating agencies in a way that would make them more comfortable that this is not going to be fluctuating depending on who's on the council. And so that's really kind of where we've been here. Is there a need to put something in the charter to more formally codify what the county does with regards to reserves? Did I summarize that vociferously enough, Jim?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I appreciate that question. First of all, I'm Gene. I'm, as was shared, Deputy Director for Budget and Policy. I've been in Montgomery County government for a little over 10 years through various different positions. I came into Zoom so I could share my screen, but apparently I'm getting feedback. All right. I'm gonna leave Zoom so that I can not have feedback. So yeah, And so to answer your question, I mean, I think I'll just be blunt. I don't think the 5% needs to change. But I'll do that based on some history that I understood. And I believe the council president came and may have shared this, so I apologize if this is repetitious, but. My review is the 5% exists because county residents didn't want the county to bank a lot of tax revenue for some future like issue, or just bank tax revenues beyond a certain percent. They all agreed that I can't tell you why 5% was selected when the charter was created. I haven't found information related to that, or at least why that specific percentage was picked. But again, the background is primarily for the 5% was you're taxing county residents to pay for services that year. You should have a balanced budget. It's okay if your budget is not balanced in the sense that you have about a 5% in revenue surplus from the year so that you can have reserves for unforeseen circumstances. But my sense is the county residents didn't want, if the tax revenues generated, say, a 10% surplus, why are you taxing us that much when you can lower our taxes? And therefore bank the 5% for emergencies. So that is my understanding and my review of why the 5% exists. However, as we found during the Great Depression or Recession in 2009, 2010, the 5%, as you noted, Jeff, goes really fast. And frankly, very rarely has the county actually achieved that 5% goal. It's usually much less than 5% in terms of actual general fund undesignated reserves is what we call them. That's the parlance that the county uses if you hear it ever. Undesignated reserves is the general fund reserves that are not appropriated that year that are in surplus, and that's the 5%. And so coming out of the Great Recession, and again, I apologize if this is all information you guys have gone through before, the county created the revenue stabilization fund through the county code, not through the charter, but through an actual law, mandating that a certain, we can go through those, or I can come, like, again, I came, as I shared today, to answer questions. If this is more germane, I can always come back with more documentation, and maybe with Mike Covey from the Department of Finance to really go through this in depth. But the revenue stabilization fund was meant to be the rainy day fund, more of a lockbox for any of those that read the code. And so certain percentages of surplus revenues for income taxes, which fluctuate based on capital gains and other things, recordation taxes and other things that are more economically related, as opposed to property taxes, will be banked if they're overestimated. If the county estimates, say, we're going to get $1 billion in income taxes in fiscal 25, but we actually get $1.5 billion, a certain percentage of that money goes into the revenue stabilization fund, as well as additional contributions. The council did a lot of work to put additional contributions into the revenue stabilization fund, primarily because the rating agencies said your 5% isn't enough. You don't have enough reserves. And so the revenue stabilization fund has become the place where we try to achieve reserves for the rating agencies. And if Mike were here from the Department of Finance, he would tell you the rating agencies don't do calculations for reserves like we do. I can get into that later if we want to, but we're actually not as high as we could be in compared to how some rating agencies would like us to be. They would like us to be closer to 20 or 25%. We're averaging around 10 to 11% of the reserves that we calculate. And so that's why the revenue stabilization fund was created, was the need to have money locked away a little more carefully than the extra money that's left over at the end of the year when they pass a budget that has a surplus. Because that money, I'll just say, the 5%, the undesignated reserves, is fairly easy for council or executives to use. If there's a need for additional funding, a program comes up, or we're short in something, that's the supplemental appropriations that the executive might send, or special appropriations the council might introduce. And they'll just note that the undesignated reserves is what we use. Additionally, the undesignated reserves, as anyone that's done budgeting knows, that's all a point in time. And so when we passed the budget this year, let me find, this is what I was going to show you. When we passed the budget this year, we estimated that fiscal 26 would end with $785 million in reserves. Of that, $714.9 million is the revenue stabilization fund. 70.2 is that 5%. It's not even close to 5%. It's probably closer to 1 and 1.5% of our revenues for the year. But that's all what we estimated on May 20th of 2025. As we go through the year, if revenues change, expenditures are different than we expected, that number will change even without any policy decisions by the council or the executive. And so that's partly why, another reason why the revenue stabilization fund exists, is to provide a better buffer, since that 5% can come and go based on actual revenues that year, actual expenditures. So whether you use the Great Depression as an example, where we burned through our reserves within like 2 months and had nothing, and we're actually, that's, those of you who were around maybe in 2009, 2010, for those fiscal years, I mean, the council was actually cutting budgets. There were staff were going on furlough because there was not enough money in reserves in order to like maintain services. Similar during the COVID era, we had a slightly different experience. Our reserves were strong, but we budgeted around unknowns. And so the reserves were there just in case. And of course, as we know, the federal government provided significant like cash to local and state jurisdictions to cover that. And so in the end, our reserves were not needed for that. But had that not happened, who knows like how those reserves would have like panned out. So I'll pause there. That's a lot of information. But that's background in terms of answering the like question, which I'll go back to, which is, and again, this is me speaking for me, Gene, as a policy analyst, not as any particular representative of anybody in county government. Like the 5% again was based on county taxpayers not wanting county government to bank a lot of additional tax revenues just for the sake of, hey, we taxed you at this amount. It worked out better than we expected versus actually considering a tax cut. But again, the rating agencies need stronger, more robust reserves, thus the revenue stabilization fund.
So it's you know, correct me if I'm misinterpreting, but it seems like what's clear is a 5% rule generally overall isn't workable, right? But everybody's recognized the need for having more than 5%. So whatever the assumption was in the original charter, that doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question is what is the best structure to have if a 5% cap in your charter doesn't work, right? And so you talked about using undesignated reserves. It's easy. It's easy to use them.
Yep.
The question is, hey, first of all, is it just as easy or is it too difficult to use the revenue stabilization fund, right? Is that, and what is the best structure for getting money into these new funds? What determines whether money goes one way or the other way? And so, you know, we're just looking at, is there something that we should recommend that the charter be fixed? So say, look, the original setup really isn't how we're doing it. And you know, let's try to reflect a way that is a more reality based and perhaps has you know, different guardrails or better guardrails. What is the ideal way to do this if you could start from scratch?
Again, I'll just be frank. The ideal way to do it is how I think we've been doing it, which is through the county code. No offense to the review commission and the charter. I mean, I've lived in the county I haven't been here indefinitely. I'm not originally from Montgomery County, I'll just be transparent, but I moved here in 2013. But I would say the charter is inflexible once you amend it. I mean, it's pretty hard once you, like, because then you have to wait for either a gubernatorial or a presidential election to amend it. And certainly when it comes to counties' finances and reserves, those things, once you lock that into the charter, it becomes much more difficult to change that, which again is why I think the 5% is fine. I think it's fine to say the county should not try to bank more than 5% of undesignated amount of money. I think the reality is, given the council's and the executives, at least more recently in the last 10 years, conversations around public need, very rarely are they going to be able to even try to bank 5%, because there's plenty of places to spend tax dollars that they will likely, that 5% is not achievable.
Well, okay, from where I think Jeff might be alluding to the fact that historically, if 5% has not been achieved, and if you're at more like 1 to 2%, historically, then the charter, if the charter is some sort of governing document, if you agree with that, certainly you want to allow the council some flexibility in managing, day-to-day operations. But what I think we're looking at is making the charter reflect reality and giving it some giving the county some operating space. So rather than making the charter more restrictive,
Mhm.
perhaps the direction should be making it more looser, more reflective of reality.
Permissive, is that the word?
Temperate. And so I guess the question, so,
I mean, right now, there's a disconnect between what the charter says and what the county, how the county's been operating for so many years, maybe, you know,
perhaps.
entire 10 years.
So I would read the charter, and maybe I've been misreading it. I would read the charter as the limitation on how much undesignated money the council can appropriate or not appropriate each year. It has, like, the idea, I would say the 5% is less about a goal for reserves, and it's more of a restriction of don't bank a lot of our tax dollars for no need. The revenue stabilization fund, which is in county code, I would say is the reserve policy of the county right now in order to meet bond agencies and also to have sufficient monies should the sky really fall, as opposed to trying to hope that they have enough restraint when approving a budget that they try to approve a budget that's closer to the 5% general. Like, because again, I would say the 5% isn't a goal as much as a ceiling. Like, please don't bank more than 5% of our tax dollars without actually using it for something. I don't think it was designed only just as like, this is your reserve fund. I think it was designed more of like a restriction on taxes. Does that, I mean, but I guess the question is if, since you guys have been talking about this, how would you make the charter more permissive in this instance? Because
Including the stabilization fund. Right now,
Okay.
there's no mention of the stabilization.
correct.
And the question is, any council majority could, in theory, change the stabilization fund to be something different by ordinance, as opposed to if this is working and the bond agencies are happy. My guess is they'd be happier if it was in the charter, because then it couldn't be messed with, as opposed to in the code, which it could. And that's, I think, we're just, does it make sense to be in the charter in some fashion for stability purposes?
So that's a different question. I think that, I mean, that's one I guess the commission can review. Again, I'll go back to my earlier statement, but this is again more of an understanding of how the kind of cogs turn. Like, yes, if you put it in the charter, I would have multiple questions. Like, I don't know if I put the revenue stabilization fund specifically in the charter. I don't know if I put a percentage in the charter, because certainly you wouldn't want to lock the county in a specific situation where the bond agencies have said something, and policy wise, the county now needs to do something different. And so they're doing something outside of the charter in order to achieve policy. And so I could see you, like, the charter having something about the county will have reserves, and they may have multiple reserve funds, because I will say right now, the county is currently looking at like the 10% goal that is a policy goal. It's not I don't want to say it's fabricated, but as I said earlier, the bond agencies do their calculations differently than the county does. And so the 10% was a policy goal set by the county executive, then Mr. Leggett, and that council, based on what they thought would be achievable in a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
But sorry, I'll just finish. I wouldn't want to put 10% in the charter, because 10% actually may not be the right number in the future. Whereas 5% I think was selected less because of a amount that thought was needed and more as a restriction on unappropriated tax funds, so that the residents weren't being taxed more than what was needed.
Yeah, my question, there are these enterprise funds,
Mhm.
and they probably have their own set of reserves.
Yes, they do.
Okay, is there's some determination, I guess some sort of research that's done to determine how much reserves are needed for WSSC, for example?
Yeah,
So-
WSSC is probably not the best example, because they're they're multi-jurisdictional, and they're a little different,
Okay,
but in terms of
enterprise.
like, I would use the Department of Permitting Services. They're an enterprise fund. And there is a understood policy in the executive branch when they're building the funds, and the council has approved this. I believe it's 5%. I have to double check on that, but yes, the enterprise funds have like an understood percent that they should try to
Right, some
achieve.
sort of bottoms up type of thing.
'Cause-
What's gonna break, how much do we need?
Because if they don't have the reserves, should something happen for their enterprise, specifically ABS, alcohol beverages services is another one, DPS is permitting services, like there's several. They would need general funds to support their operations, or they would need to reduce their budget mid-year, and so that's why those enterprise funds have an understood percentage reserves. And I think in the policy document, it states that most funds, like the Mass Transit Fund, which is a separate tax fund in the county, the fire district, which is a separate tax fund in the county, but those should be close to 0% because those are all similar to the general fund, and so they're all part of the same milieu, at least in this conversation. But DPS, ABS, sorry, I shouldn't use all the acronyms.
It's good.
But those funds, yeah, they do have, and depending on how deep you all want to go, because again, as I got this email right before vacation, I was like, well, let's see what we want to talk about. I can come back if it becomes a germane, like with all of the different fiscal plans that are produced each year for these enterprise funds. So because that's where they shows you the fund reserves. And so that's what the council sees and in essence approves when they do the budget, even though they don't approve a multi-year budget, they're approving the understanding that this is the current estimate for reserves for those enterprise funds. But those are separate from the 5% or the 10% for the general.
Okay, I'll just say one more.
Yeah.
Right now, the charter is silent on that. So,
Yeah. And I would say I don't have as a county resident and or as a policy person in the county government, I would say that is something worth looking at. Like, should the county charter be silent on that and leave it to policymakers to handle in the moment, or should there be something more explicit in the county charter? I don't know. I would still come back to, at least from the policy side, again, given that you get a bite of the apple once every 2 years, and you need enough of the residents to agree with that bite. If something needs a change in the charter, I would always lean less from using the charter as a mechanism to create the structure if it's at least well understood enough that the structure provides the space that governance needs to occur, rather than hoping the charter would be the mechanism that keeps everybody contained. For reserves, because those just are constantly changing. I mean, I'll be honest, we're going to have a July work session. It's on the committee, the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee. I think it's July 24th, but don't quote me on that. Talking about reserves, because again, as I noted, the 10% a bit arbitrary, but it was what the policymakers thought in 2010, 2011 we could achieve in a reasonable amount of time. It's still not equal to what the rating agencies want us to see us have. And so finance has been looking, Department of Finance and the council has been looking at is 10% enough? If not, what is the right way to do it? And I think, Jeff, this is something you mentioned earlier, maybe there are other types of reserves we need to create for capital and other things that provide a little more flexibility in the revenue stabilization fund. But again, at least as a policy wonk, that all is in the county code, as opposed to having it locked in the charter under specific terminology and percentages. But that, again, I'm speaking for myself there. It's just
I guess my takeaway is that you're telling us from your perspective, if our goal is flexibility or a more permissive structure, it's more likely to be the one we have than the one you could cook up and put into a charter that would require, major years of action through both legislative initiative and voter approval and a commission like this looking at it. It requires a lot more. It's more likely to be rigid rather than flexible. And right now, it's sufficiently flexible that you have policymakers in the council doing it by majority vote, rather than a more complex voter process.
I think that is accurate. I would also say, thinking about more recent charter ballot initiatives that have been on the chart, actually out for voters, in the last 10 years. I think it's really I would just say, when I speak with my neighbors and they see a ballot initiative, they have very even the plain language of trying to help them understand what they're about to vote for is not sufficient for them to understand why that, other than again, not to you'll use the more recent one, should the county executive have a 3-year term limit or a 2-year term limit? I think that was that was sufficiently understood by most voters, that they knew what they were voting for, whether they regardless. But I think for the reserves, I'm not sure what you would write that wouldn't be super in the weeds in a way that I think most voters would look at it and be like, I have no idea what I'm voting for here. I mean, I'm just being honest.
I have stood at the polls. I've had several elections where my job was to stand at the polls and explain ballot initiatives to voters. I know how difficult it is and how hard it is for them to get information that they can absorb.
Sure, and especially if it's something that's trying, I mean, but again, I think that's why this commission exists and something worth exploring. Is there language, is there something that does what maybe the group is, or some individuals in the group are at least trying to consider? Is there a way to create a more transparent reserve policy in the charter without making it restrictive? That's like, if that's the intent, then I would say like happy to look at that with you all as you guys go through it.
There's a 7 vote requirement as opposed to a simple majority requirement in the code.
To change the code?
No, the code, the provision of the code that creates revenue
Yes.
stabilization says if you're going to use it, you need, or move it around, you need 7 votes instead of 6.
Correct. Also, the other restriction is that for the revenue stabilization fund to be used, you have to have appropriated funds that no longer have revenue to support those appropriations. And so you would have to have a situation where the revenues have changed so significantly in that fiscal year that if, say, and I don't have specific numbers, but if we had $4.5 billion worth of tax revenue for fiscal 26 that we estimated, and so we did $4.5 billion worth of appropriations, but now our revenues are $3.5 billion and there's a $1 billion delta. Like that's when the revenue stabilization fund would be able to be
It has
taxed.
to be an actual short.
There has to actually be a shortage of funds, of revenues available for the appropriations as approved in the budget, not supplementals, not additional things that come up, but based on the budget approval in May, there needs to be a shortage of funds for those appropriations. And I can pull the law up and find that specific text, but it's not just the 7 votes are needed to use them, yes, but like there are some other requirements prior to they can even take a vote.
You don't see any need to lower the 7 to a simple majority.
No, I don't. Well, that would be a question, I think, for probably our legislative attorneys, because only because my guess is the 7 was created, and maybe it was already updated to 7 when we went to 11, but there were a lot of when we had 9 council members, there were a lot of numbers that may or may not have been updated, and I don't know if this was one of them.
Having Glass has told us several times, he made sure every number was.
Well, then I'll trust Councilmember Glass. So that may be why, it may have been originally 6 for a 2/3 majority, or a 2/3 vote under the 9 council members.
Right.
And there were some, I would just say when we went to 11, there were a lot of different calculations that needed to be done to decide which number was it, 7 or 8 they needed to go to, because 11 is obviously not easily divisible into 2/3.
So we have 2 people on the screen with hands up. I don't know who was first or second, but the picture is bigger.
I was gonna say David was first based on the line.
Okay, go ahead, Dan. David, you're muted.
Yes, good morning. I'm on the board of directors of a condominium, and the state passed a law a couple of years ago based on you recall the incident in Florida where a high-rise building collapsed, and now homeowners associations and condominium boards are required to conduct a reserve study every 5 years, and then to budget their reserve account to be prepared to deal with the reserve expenses that are outlined in that reserve study. Those reserves, the reserve studies relate primarily to the capital that is owned by the condominium and the replacement costs when those capital items either deteriorate or are destroyed. So it doesn't cover operating expenses as the unfunded reserves of the county do, where there may be a shortfall and you need money just because you didn't have enough income. But would it make sense for the charter to require a reserve study of the physical plant, the capital owned by the county, and that the reserve study result in the creation of a plan for the expenditures and then a reserve amount collected and accrued over time to provide the funds for the day when a school collapses or the county courthouse elevators go out or some other major capital expense has to be expended, so that there's money there and you don't have to try to have a supplemental appropriation.
Thank you for your question, David. Also love the shirt. As a fellow Star Wars fan. So I would say two things. One, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, that I'm not sure, like, if we need to do a reserve study, and I'll just say this, I'm disappointed, not disappointed, that's the wrong word. It's unfortunate that Mike couldn't join us, because I believe finance has been doing a reserve study. That's why we're going to have a conversation about this at the GO committee in July. And I think one of the items is related to what you're talking about, is do we need to have a capital fund reserve for the very things you're talking about? So I would say stay tuned. Whether it should be in the charter or not, again, I think that's a question for the commission to debate and to discuss. I think what I said earlier, I'm not sure the charter needs to mandate a study every certain amount of time. I think we have plenty of knowledgeable staff, both on the executive and legislative side, to do that work or to initiate that work in a period when it believes when it feels like, or maybe our policy is not in line with what we see or hear from rating agencies, or actually what we see or hear from the community in terms of our actual financial needs. I mean, the last thing I'll say is the Revenue Stabilization Fund is to your point, is primarily for operating expenditures based on how the appropriations are set. So one would say that the general fund undesignated reserve, the 5% I noted, or the maximum of 5% I noted earlier, would be where you would pull for capital needs that were outside of the ordinary.
And it may well be that 5% is sufficient if we actually, the state legislature, when it imposed this burden on condominiums and homeowner associations, did not impose it on county governments. And I'm guessing there's a reason for that. And but it may well turn out that 5% is sufficient if a reserve study is done and a reserve plan is created. That there would be, in most years, no need to go higher than 5%.
Fair enough.
So earlier you talked about what happened during COVID, and you mentioned that the reserve fund disappeared really quickly, and it was fortunate that the federal government stepped in with plenty of resources. Could you talk to what would have happened had the federal government not stepped in at a time of crisis?
Sure. I maybe I misspoke. The reserves were depleted rather quickly during the Great Depression in 2009. During COVID, our reserves actually were rather strong. And so, I mean, the reality is that the federal government provided sufficient resources to cover a lot of the needs, additional needs that the counties and states decided to pick up during the COVID era, depending on their policy and or
my question wasn't what would happen if they did pick up.
Correct. Well,
what would happen had they not decided to make, both in the Great Depression and during COVID? What would have happened to to local government and local government agencies had the federal government not stepped in?
Sure. So for the Great Depression, we had weaker reserves and burned through those, and so that's why the county went through significant furloughs or RIFs and other things to reduce personnel count, and had some strong cuts in many of the budgets. Currently, because the Revenue Stabilization Fund was stronger during the COVID era, we would probably have burned through that, although that money can't be used unless we had appropriated it during the budget for new initiatives. And COVID was a new thing. So again, that would be the undesignated reserve. And so the county would have had to make some hard decisions. Do we cut budgets in order to spend money elsewhere? Or do we not spend money elsewhere to meet the needs of our community? But in terms of, if the federal government hadn't stepped in, we would have burned through some of the Revenue Stabilization Fund, but I think it would be...
No, you wouldn't have burned through the Revenue Stabilization Fund because you couldn't have known to appropriate that money in advance, because it was an event that came up that was unforeseen.
That's fair.
Come up with resources out of the reserve, but as you've mentioned, the reserve itself is not a floor, it's a cap. So in any given year, you may only have 1% in there, given whatever the rest of the government is
Correct.
So you couldn't have taken money out of the stabilization fund because it's a new incident, unforeseen at the time of budgeting. So you would have had to go and cut services. Or furlough people. I mean, those are really the options. Can't get rid of capital. Physical space can't be got rid of in that kind of timelines. It's about either cutting services, cutting contracts, cutting people, right?
Certainly, if the revenues are less than expected, and we need to do new things, yes. But yeah, I would need to think about it some more.
Thank you.
Okay. So while we still have a few minutes here,
I'm here all morning, so I'm at your pleasure.
We're not though. People that need to go to work.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So let me just change topics real quickly. The ballot initiative is out there now,
Yes.
dealing with the operating budget. What it would do would, there's a political component of it, which is that instead of needing 7 votes, you'd have to be unanimous to increase the budget beyond the rate of inflation.
Correct.
Okay. And that's a political dynamic you could judge one way or the other. But the other thing it would do is it would change which consumer price index is used. I haven't heard or discerned any reason why one index is better than the other. And then there's a secondary question, which is why are we tying government expenditures to consumer prices when the government isn't really buying consumer goods? It's buying labor and industrial services and construction. It's buying a lot of things. And it's paying for a lot of things that have nothing to do with the consumer prices. But so those are 2 separate questions. But do you have any idea why it would choose to change the index from Baltimore, Washington, district area to Washington, Arlington, Alexandria, the district area?
So my guess is because I have to go back. It's been a while. The BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, changed the regional areas probably 8-9 years ago. And so what the county used to be in the Baltimore, Washington metropolitan area, we're no longer in that area. We're in the Washington, Alexandria, Arlington, something. I can't say it all, but I think that's a lot of, because that happened, that's a lot of the reason why when you see whatever index is mentioned in county code or elsewhere, it usually has or successor index. Because we realize we can't peg ourselves to an index that may not exist. So I have briefly looked at the proposed charter amendment. But if the difference is between the Baltimore, Washington versus the Washington, Alexandria, it's because the county is no longer BLS changed the index, and so we're now in the Washington. But that's only based on what you said. I haven't looked at all the information.
Okay. That's actually helpful.
Yeah.
There's
So
logic to it.
yeah. No, I mean, and yeah, that's the reality, and so I think in 30 years the BLS may change, and maybe not. I mean, they may change our index again. They may put us in a different metropolitan region for some odd reason, and so I think that's why a lot of code, and like I said, I know I'm repeating myself now, but a lot of it said or successor index because we just want to avoid a situation where we need to update a lot of code because we're no longer in a certain index.
And then the second question is, why are we tying governmental expenses to a consumer price index when it's like apples and oranges to me?
Well, yeah, I think that one's more politically motivated in terms of a conversation. But I'll just note that what I've seen is that the charter requires the council and the county to have spending affordability guidelines, and it doesn't say anything much more than that. And I think this is germane to our other conversation about reserves. The charter kind of puts an expectation out there, but then leaves it to the policymakers to define that expectation, and that's not that different also from other things. The county council might adopt a code that says there's this program that then defers to the executive branch to actually put a regulation in place to implement that program rather than trying to do the nuts and bolts in the law. And so the county code does have a spending affordability guideline process. And a lot of the text that I've read, at least from my sense, that they want to insert in the charter is directly from the county code. And now mandated it in the charter in terms of what's our policy already. And so the policy that we currently have does use inflation of the CPI as one measurement for estimating what a appropriate amount of growth in expenditures should be as one benchmark. But there are other benchmarks the council could use if they wish. In terms of like whether the county should be pegged to a CPI or not, I think is a good question. I don't know what other index we would be pegged to. As you all know, we're personnel heavy, like all governments. And so our growth in expenditures is more due to our personnel than it is to purchasing items that are on the market, so to speak. Other than building like goods, like highways and actual like facilities if we need to purchase those things. But beyond that, we're not purchasing groceries in the same sense as like a
Offhand, do you happen to know which section of the code? Is it section 52?
No, it is, if you give me 2 minutes, I'll find it for you. It's under finance.
This is definitely the more politically driven thing.
So,
Yeah, ballot, sure.
well, and I would, so the council, I think, and I can also send, and I can send this also later and links to the information if you guys want to have these resources. So, each year the council reviews the operating budget spending affordability guidelines in January and has to adopt them by the second Tuesday of February. And so I can send you last year's or the 2020-25 like staff packet where that happens and the council's decision. And then come the budget resolution in terms of when they're adopting an official budget, there is a resolution for the spend affordability guidelines, whether they meet it or not, and what the voting threshold is based on the code.
We have a lot of that,
No, I know, I'm just saying like,
but appreciate the offer. Yeah.
I think what I'm getting at is that the council currently is doing some of what is being noted in as part of this ballot initiative. Like it's already in county code and they're actually using it. And so I would say you can go look at how they voted on that spending affordability guideline resolution for the last 50 years or 20 years, however long it's in terms of how the votes split, if they have split at all, in terms of how much weight that has in terms of their decision making when it comes to passing the budget.
Gene, the finance chapter is chapter 20.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm.
Chapter 20 of the code.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, part of the political calculus, it seems to me, of these budget initiatives or ballot initiatives is to draw the public's attention to what's going on.
Mhm.
So whether it passes or not,
Yeah,
it's a way to.
so spending affordability guidelines for operating budget starts on section 2059 of the county code. So it'll get your definitions, the process to adopt the guidelines, what indicators you're supposed to review, and then approval of how the budget works. So, and what I'll say is that currently the code, if the aggregate operating budget exceeds inflation, they currently need 7 votes. If they exceed the aggregate operating budget that they set in February, they need 8 votes.
And this amendment would say, and if you're actually gonna go ahead and appropriate.
If you're gonna do it now, you need 11.
You're gonna need all 11.
All 11, no matter what you set. So then in the end, I think if let's say it's as written, it's adopted by the county residents, and I don't know if like I haven't seen it. It hasn't gone through all its legal like muster, so I can't speak to that. I'm just theorizing here. Then the council would stop bothering to set affordability guidelines at all, and we would just have a budget resolution that says like, you're exceeding. Here's the aggregate operating budget from last year. Here's that times the current index. You need 11 votes to exceed that. There would be no need to set guidelines for themselves.
8 votes wouldn't be enough to need 11 anyway, you must just go.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying there would be no need to have any work of actually setting the guideline on what the ceiling should be for the budget conversation, because the ceiling is dictated now in the charter in terms of voting thresholds.
So I'm going to have a call, one more call for anybody who's got another question or topic they want to raise before we let.
I would.
Go ahead. Right ahead.
Okay, I'm looking ahead and maybe you're, we need to speak to other people, but are you aware of the infrastructure funding work group?
Yes, I am.
Are you part of it?
I am.
You are. Can you kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of how you view this funding work group to work and what the goals are? And how would it interact with county code, possibly the charter?
Well, I don't know about the last question, so I just full transparency, I started here as deputy director in March, and after the budget was released, and so my first job is headed off by the executive director was to get through budget. And then I would say the infrastructure funding work group was duties as assigned. So I've been getting into that a little bit. So I would in terms of answering the charter question, I don't know. It was passed by council resolution. So the goals, and I apologize, I don't have it memorized because there's a lot of them, but the goals are set in the council resolution. So I can pull that up and read through it, but and just for full transparency, since there's a website, if you go to work groups under the council, you can find it there. Our first meeting is Friday. It's mostly a kickoff meeting just to get the balls rolling. It's mostly there's varying levels of staff, but it's a lot of staff from county government and planning and parks. And MCPS there's one there, and then there's a nonprofit developer from Montgomery Housing Partnerships and a for-profit developer from Bozzuto. But it's primarily, and so I would say the goal right now is to get everybody rowing in the same direction to figure out how we're going to achieve the goal that the council set out in the resolution. So they want recommendations on funding mechanisms, and again, don't quote me on this specifically, but the funding mechanisms all of that needs to be under the auspices of understanding environmental sustainability, racial equity, just cost effectiveness. There's a whole slew of things that these need to be weighted on. So for this meeting, we're just getting our legs underneath ourselves as a work group, but also getting ready. I mean, we need to pull in data on what our current infrastructure needs and future needs are, and kind of come to an agreement on what those numbers are and what that horizon looks like, before you could start estimating actual costs to do those things, and therefore what funding mechanisms could be used to do that. But I will say this, based on my research, there are no magic trees out there of funding mechanisms that this county doesn't know about already. We all know the universe of funding mechanisms we could use, fees, taxes, etc. So the work, the way I see it, at least the council staff that are working with me on it see it, is more of a exercise to put actual bounds on those numbers in terms of cost and estimates, so that policymakers can make decision of which mechanism makes the most sense.
Just one more question, I guess. Where do you, what's your sense of where you're gonna start? Are you gonna start from the 6-year budget, 6-year capital budget?
No, so I don't know where we're gonna start, because I'm gonna let the work group have that conversation.
Because it's, as you said, it's assessing the needs and then coming up with the funding sources. And so
Correct.
assessing the needs, it seems to me you possibly look at the budget.
Well, so there's only so many places we can go. I mean, so there'll be someone there from MCPS, someone there from DOT, planning, parks, and finance, but we'll need to get some other input from the county's Department of General Services that might do other facilities such as fire stations, police departments, things like that may be needed for growth. I mean, so certainly I believe the executive side will, they can theorize it here, will probably be more bound to the 6-year plan. Planning, and my guess is going to look at master plans in the 30-year to 40-year time horizon that's in there. And since we have those different people on the work group, we'll need to come to a consensus of what our time horizon is in terms of future needs. So that we make that and then have that be a decision point. At least how I see it. I don't think it's going to be handed down here's the decision point. I think the group needs to decide what the time horizon is in order to estimate future needs, knowing that policymakers may make a different decision, costs may change, all of those caveats and asterisks, but no, I don't know what the actual answer is gonna be, because the group needs to decide that.
Gene, what's the official name of the?
Infrastructure funding work. So if you go to Montgomery County Council's homepage and go to committees, the drop-down menu has work groups and reports. It's under there. We'll be meeting in this room on Friday at 9:30 for our kickoff meeting. It is open meetings required, so public, yeah, the council put that in there as part of the resolution. So we're not gonna broadcast it like they do. So like we'll have minutes, like written minutes to cover what.
Is that unusual for staff meetings?
It is less unusual currently. A lot of the work groups the council is creating are being like they're choosing to have the resolution include that the work group is subject to the Open Meetings Act. And that's like, I think that, and I'll just be honest, you can look at our agenda, like we have like 20 minutes devoted not only to the council resolution, just talking around that, making sure we all understand the goals there, but also about open meetings, because you're right, like most of the staff, when it comes to, for instance, when it comes to the work group's work, like as we're all staff doing our daily business, like we all can't email each other about work group business.
Yeah, I can imagine how difficult.
So we're there is time devoted to that for the work group to get used to like what that means for this specific work product. I mean, the work product, like, so there's supposed to be a check-in for the GO committee between November and January. I mean, we'll see when that gets set. The actual final report is due by June 30th of 2026. I'm sorry, I chuckle a little bit because the horizon's far enough away that it feels like a long-term project. Hopefully we'll get more through it before, because once budget comes, my team's not gonna be working on anything other than that, the budget, not the work group's work, but I think we're all familiar that there's a primary election coming in June, so I'm curious how this report will be weighed in after a budget has been passed and the
Yeah, I'm
primary has been.
curious to see what, in the charter, for example, it says, it defines the projects in the 6-year program
Mhm.
as capital improvements. Right?
Yep.
And then this funding work group is looking at infrastructure projects.
Yep.
There's an overlap, but maybe there's not, totally, it's not totally.
Yeah, and that. I don't know, they maybe not, I haven't really thought about it, only in the sense, because right now I'm thinking about the work group's work product, which is a report. Which is funny, because I think they did one in 2007, so we had an infrastructure funding work group back in the mid 2000s that did similar work, so we'll see if we come up with anything different.
David, your hand is up. I don't know if that's your original hand or a new hand.
A new hand, and just if I can, since you talked about using the CPI as a marker for making changes, has there ever been discussion of using the county's gross domestic product as a marker instead or in addition to? Assuming there's a way to determine what the county's gross domestic product is, because that sort of defines the pool of economic activity locally.
Yeah.
That would be providing the potential for tax revenues. But what's your thought on using the GDP instead of CPI or both?
So I don't think I've heard that discussed in any of the circles I run in, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been discussed in other circles in the county government. I mean, we can get that data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. It's usually 2 years behind our current year, so that, I mean, that's probably more of the issue with that metric, is where the data is lagging by a lot more than the CPI. And in fact, if you look at the CPI data, it's always a year behind of where we are anyway. It's what happened the last. And it's also odd. A lot of ours is like from November to December of the next year. It's not even a calendar year or a fiscal year. I don't know. I mean, that like many things, it's something to explore and look at, but I don't personally know. I have not heard that this raised in any of my discussions when it comes to like benchmarking what the county's growth should or shouldn't be.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief.
This has been very informative and we have really benefited and people very useful in our discussions as we go forward, and we will certainly get back or ask Christine or Stephen to contact you if we want to add you. Mike has agreed to come talk to us at our next meeting, but which won't be until September, so
Okay,
it's maybe if you both want to come back, I would.
maybe I'll pop in to make sure I didn't say anything wrong today when Mike speaks. No, I think we're in agreement. And I will note that, at least for the reserve conversation, since the GO committee, the Government Operations Fiscal Box, is going to be specifically talking about this in the reserve study that finance has done in the last year. I would say for you all, whether you watch it in real time or later, or at least look at the staff packet and the report. I mean, I think that my guess is Mike will probably bring that information and talk about that most in September, because that will be what has been live before the council goes on recess in August. Thank you. All right, you all have a great day. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And like you said, just have Christine or Stephen email me if you need any documentation or anything specifically, and I can get it to them and they'll get it to the group.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
I just sent around an email with all the infrastructure work group stuff.
Perfect.
To the commissioner, so the resolution and the webpage, so you should all have that.
So I will breeze real quickly through the administrative stuff, this thing, get it off our agenda here. I sent around the agenda, and we also sent around the minutes. Anybody have any proposed changes to the agenda, the minutes at this point? If not, I will consider the agenda, both the agenda and the minutes of our regular meeting adopted by unanimous consent.
Well, I wasn't there, so. Yeah, do I need to decline or step aside or,
Yeah, you could just abstain.
okay, abstain?
Yes, you abstain from the unanimous consent. It's not unanimous consent, it's.
Minus
7 out of 8,
one.
okay. Thank you. Quick report, I did have a chance to attend the meeting of the Western Citizens Advisory Board. It's on June 16th. They were very receptive. They were very appreciative that they came. They are going to take a look at some of our meeting videotapes, and they understand a couple of issues that we've been discussing. And they will consider whether or not they have some input they want to provide. I've invited them to provide it one of 3 ways, either by sending us written comments, by inviting us back to attend one of their future meetings, or by them attending one of our listening sessions in the fall. So they said they will take us up on that offer and see what they have to say. We're still trying to schedule a time to do something similar with the East County Citizens Advisory Board, which would be 4 out of 5. Delegate is having presented to 4 out of 5 of the boards. I have still not heard yet back from Silver Spring. Okay, I have some time here on our agenda for follow-up discussions among ourselves on any of the topics that Gene went over with us. So why don't we just go through real quick? Budget reserves, Jeff, is there any follow-up discussion you want to have?
Not right now. I want to think through. My thought was that maybe the charter simply needs to identify that there needs to be a stabilization fund, as opposed to getting into the specifics of how it operates and allow the code to dictate the specifics. But I want to think that through a little bit.
Okay.
Jim, I do. Just because the deputy budget director has an opinion does not mean that we have an opinion. Just because he does not want to be tied by the charter and the politicians don't want to be tied by the charter does not mean that we do not want them tied by the charter. They have different perspectives and different prerogatives to us. So I say that because it very quickly the conversation very quickly turned to, oh yeah, we want to provide more flexibility, as if that was a given, and I'm not sure it's a given. What they said is that when there was a catastrophe, they weren't prepared. So in the Great Depression, 2009, they burned through their money, and thank God the federal government stepped in. In COVID, they had no mechanism for addressing an outside incident or an incident that was unforeseen and thank God the government stepped in. The federal government stepped in. Like assuming that somebody is going to come to the rescue with a cape and a halo is not good policy. So I'm not saying I'm picking one way or the other. I'm just saying that I wasn't satisfied with those parts of the conversation. Like I thought that was pretty like brushed under the table. Like, oh yeah, in 2009 we would have been laying off people, but thank God the government stepped in. Well, yeah, next time we might not have a government that feels like stepping in. You know, this COVID, with the enormous amounts of money that were appropriated from the federal government to local governments to save everyone's hide, you know, was pretty unprecedented. And I don't think that expecting that to happen is necessarily a good policy model. And so I just wanted to put that out on the table, that we should reserve our right to think through these issues, whether or not the council and the existing staff, you know, are interested in having their hands tied, because those kinds of people have different, have different incentives from what we may have when thinking about it from a non-political, non-small p or even big P political perspective, just a good government perspective. So that's my piece, and I'll put my hand.
I really appreciate. I agree with you. Our perspective is not always going to be the same, and we do reserve our rights. So here's what I'd like to propose then. We have an August recess traditionally, and we'll come back in September. What I'd like to do is, we originally sort of formed a finance work group originally. It was you and Jeff, and I think David joined it, and I don't know if Mike was on it or not, but I guess the question is, can we have your work group get together and sort of give us a path forward for how we could have these issues, you know, have our discussion structured, or have our work structured going forward on this issue, so that we're sort of progressing logically through it in September and October, because eventually we are going to have public listening sessions where we want to sort of be able to present the issue in a concrete way by November, hopefully. And then we're going to have to sort of stake out formal positions by December, January in order to start drafting a report. So could you guys kind of work on, and anyone else who wants to join the work group, as long as you don't get past the open meeting requirement that you don't get a majority, but can you sort of see us to structuring sort of a path forward starting at our September meeting? I don't know if that means making assignments or doing research projects, or.
Mike, do you want to just call a meeting, or shall I mean, one of us just to call a meeting of the three of us, and we'll get together offline and talk through what the path forward might look like. We could do that in perhaps, one evening next week.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's fine.
I'm in.
Okay.
Get the band back together again.
And, okay.
Yeah, give yourselves a name too.
Let's not do name call. No name call.
No, I didn't know. I didn't mean name calling, but.
All right. Now the other group we had this one, Mike, you had was looking at tax issues, which seems to be now it's taken sort of a different direction. Do you want to talk about the infrastructure funding?
Well,
work group, or whatever you want
that's
to do?
kind of, yeah, wait and see. It sounds like it's operating independent of us at this point, and it's got its own
Hopefully.
momentum. So let's see how they proceed.
You propose attending that? That's right. I guess it'll be video online. You don't have to attend. You can actually watch it anytime.
Yes, if I can.
This is the 24th.
The one on the 24th. Okay. And then David, you had raised with me, and I put it on the agenda at your request, the issue about the provision section 305 in terms of changing tax rates, which is currently not tied to any index, right? It does. We did. I think the charter was amended in 2020, and the 2020 charter amendment moved us from tying tax rates to revenues, to unshackling it from a revenue perspective, and just to require unanimous vote. And you wanted to sort of talk about whether or not that provision, in terms of the tax rate levies, should be tied to some sort of an index. You want to talk about that?
Well, again, I'm getting back to the idea of using the gross domestic product of the county as a way to determine what caps should be imposed or what um, flexibility should be allowed in terms of setting future budgets. I'm not sure whether I may have had other thoughts at the time, but I am not. They're not rising to the top of my brain right now. But that was something that I was curious about. We have economic activity, and that should in some way limit or provide the funds for the county to do what it needs to do, realizing that some of the county's activities may be part of that gross domestic product. I'm not sure how much of that is occurring or not in the way that the GDP would be calculated.
So
My
what's the
first-
advantage of using GDP?
Pardon?
What's the advantage of using GDP? Why is that a good method?
Well, I don't know. I think it's because we're looking more locally. We're looking within only the county and determining what we should be spending for the county.
So what if the GDP went down but the inflation went up? I like why? I mean, the GDP may not have anything to do with the cost of running the activities that the government is running, although it would have some correlation, as you said, more economic activity, more GDP, presumably more revenue. But the costs are more tied to inflation than they are to, or cost of living kind of things, than they are to economic activity, maybe.
Hard to know because we've had a new complicating factor thrown at us recently, which is tariffs, which are totally extraneous to the county, but affect the prices in the CPI for sure down the
Right.
road, and may affect economic activity as well in terms of business activity falling off because tariffs affect the ability of businesses to operate. And
Probably be a lagging effect. Probably take a while to come through all the way to the county,
yeah,
I'm
maybe.
going to take a more simplistic approach, which is in terms of trying to have a balanced budget. The most important thing in terms of how much you decide to spend is how much your revenue is going to be, right?
exactly.
So you're basically looking at revenue, and that revenue could increase possibly because of inflation, but could also increase from increased economic activity or increasing your tax base or the amount of land that's been developed that produces taxes. So a lot of things go into the revenue formula, and the most important thing is spending be tied to revenue, not to be tied to a particular set of costs going up. Because it's revenue that's going to fund your spending, not your costs.
Yeah, but surely your requirements aren't tied to revenue. In fact, your requirements are exactly the opposite of.
No, right now it's untied. It's untied. They decide to spend what they're going to spend. Obviously, they use spending affordability guidelines to project revenue. But they decide that the county charter doesn't require that they set a spending budget based on anything other than their determination of what's affordable.
Right. Also, what's necessary. So,
Right.
and your revenue, so revenue goes down, that could have a inverse relationship to requirements going up. In other words,
Right.
you get less tax revenue when people are poorer, and we need to do more things when people are poorer.
Yeah. But just looking at the index of prices isn't going to tell you that, which is why it's not
The
high.
price is going to tell you what the cost of doing what you're already doing.
Maybe if
The index goes up, it's going to cost more to do that which you are already doing. If your cost goes down, it's going to cost you less to do what you're already doing. So it's an important I mean, it's a really important, you start off by saying, what's the cost of doing business? And inflation is the way you understand what the cost of doing business is. Then you say, well, how do we want to change what business we do? That's a secondary question. That's a policy question, not a just sort of factual question. If inflation went up by 50%, it would cost 50% more to do the same amount of things. Not that inflation's ever going up by 50%, but whatever. Anyhow, I think I said enough.
Anyway, I can understand why there is no tie in the current provision. It's just, they have to look at all of the factors, including the cost of what they happen to be purchasing, which may or may not be reflected in the consumer. All right, any more on that topic? All right, let's go on to staff. Do we have any staff updates? Does staff have anything to add at this point?
I do not have anything.
Have any of you looked at the comment file lately to see that we don't have any public comments?
No one from the public seems to be writing it at this point. As of
Okay.
Monday morning.
Making sure we,
I check every Monday morning and I will forward it on to the whole group if we receive anything.
thank you.
Yeah.
I also attached as part of our agenda, the proposed schedule going forward. So I thought it was time for us to kind of look out and see where we are and where we need to go to get us to a reported end of April. So this is a time for folks to weigh in on that, and you can certainly, if you haven't had a chance to look at, that's fine. Email me with suggestions or additions or proposed changes, and then at the next meeting, I'll come prepared to present a revised schedule. But if folks have had a chance to look at this, then this now's the time to have your comments on what this schedule looks like and what it's proposing.
Looked reasonable to me. I did have a chance to look at it.
Okay, thank you. But again, between now and September, feel free to shoot me an email with suggested additions or changes. We will consider those. Okay, does anybody else have anything else they want to talk about? It's open season here. We have a few more minutes for anybody who wants to raise anything we haven't covered. Not hearing anything, I think we will stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a very productive meeting.
Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say, wow, we